Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is Dr. David Reedman. I am the creator of the K through 12 school shooting database, and I write the weekly school shooting data analysis and reports Substack. As I'm populating the school shooting database, like many prior episodes, I see papers that reference it. And one that stood out to me recently was titled Run, Hide, or Freeze: Social and Emotional Influence on Behavior in an Immersive School Shooting Simulation. And I've had many people talk to me about creating simulations, about the different things that you could do to see hypothetical school shooting scenarios. So I am so glad to have my guest on the show today is Kevin Kapadia. He is a PhD candidate at the University of Southern California and the author of this paper. Kevin, thanks for joining the show.
Thank you for having me. I've actually been following your database for a while, and it's been cited in a lot of papers. So, glad that you chose this one. Happy to talk about it.
Well, what really got me interested in this paper is first run, hide, and fight, or when somebody would freeze during a shooting, is all based on a concept that hasn't had a lot of empirical evidence behind it. And the power of using computer simulations to start gathering kind of objective data around the way that people behave can really inform policy with evidence rather than assumptions. This is part of a series of papers you've written from kind of what sparked your research interest in talking about kind of developing simulations for school shooting scenarios.
Yeah, so great question. So this is the second paper utilizing the Unity platform. The first paper we had was titled The Impact of Social Influence and Threat Uncertainty on Behavior in a School Shooting Simulation. And what motivated that paper was going back to the architectural design principles to help prevent mass school shootings. And those researchers were using computer simulations to just see, based on this design principle, can we reduce the number of casualties? But we thought, how can we take this a step further? How does the architecture or other variables that we can manipulate in these already created school simulations then go on to influence behavior? So whether participants choose to run or hide, how long does it take them to hide, et cetera? How does it get impacted by different variables such as how close the shooter starts to them? And in the original paper, we also, the main DV that we had, or sorry, the main independent variable we had manipulated was what do the NPCs do around you? And so do the NPCs run? Do they hide? Or is it a mixed behavior that, we would expect probably in a more typical school shooting? And what we found in that paper was that whether the NPCs run or hide had a significant impact on whether the participant themselves chose to run or hide in the simulation. So this new paper, Run, Hide, or Freeze, we thought, okay, well, can we take this, one step further and not just look at whether the NPCs are running, hiding, or it's a mix of the behaviors. We also wanted to see if how emotional the simulation was could impact whether participants were more likely to follow the NPCs around them or not.
And for the folks who aren't listening, NPC is non-player characters. So in a video game, that would be any of the purely computer or simulated characters. So if you imagine Grand Theft Auto, that's all the pedestrians walking around on the street, driving other cars, but there's not a human controlling them. Those are just an NPC or a non-player character.
Yes, thank you for clarifying that. And so these NPCs have scripted commands such as to run, and then they would follow a specific path, and it's up to the individual participant to decide whether they want to choose to follow those NPCs or forge their own path. And what's I think particularly useful in these school shooting simulations is we can simulate how participants would move without putting them in any sort of danger, without exposing them to too much actual stress. And so these results can then be used to apply to more real scenarios without some of the disadvantages of in-person simulations, such as like the time and the cost.
And so this simulation that you created kind of described the environment that's kind of the foundation for where you start building the experiments within it.
Yes. So in this simulation, we based this off of a school that came from the Unity simulation was originally built from collaborators we have at USC, and so it just models a small school with a few classrooms, I believe a total of 7 classrooms, and a cafeteria, kitchen, etc. So then what we're looking at is, depending on, the participant is usually starting in the cafeteria, and in the first paper the shooter would come in from different entrances or exits. In this paper we just had the shooter come in from the front entrance, as we found in the first study that it didn't really matter how close the shooter started, so we were like, let's manipulate a new variable now. But so yes, then the participant can choose to exit. And then also we were looking at, for example, how fast they exit, whether they're in a high or low emotional condition. And yes. So,
So you were able to recruit 285 people to participate in your experiment with 6 different experimental conditions. How does somebody go about, because a lot of the listeners are not academic researchers, how do you go about finding that participant sample, getting the people um, to run your simulation, and then how do you decide which experimental condition each one of those people go to create a valid kind of empirical finding from this?
so great question. One of the things we wanted to do in these series of studies is try to be as generalizable as possible in the terms of the findings, because while these specific studies are about school shootings, this shooting behavior, this escape behavior, is not necessarily limited to just students. It's something that could affect any sort of mass shooting event. And so we use a website called Prolific, which helps you find online participants. Typically, in on Prolific, you would give them a survey, but you can do any sort of behavioral task, or in this case, a simulation. And so we also used Qualtrics to as sort of the central survey point. And so we would recruit these participants on Prolific. They'd be given a description of the study, and if they chose to participate, then they would, enter the survey, and we would fill out some preliminary information, including their emotional state, and just to make sure that they understood what they were signing up for. As you can imagine, this is a study that does require informed consent. Once they proceeded past those stages, we just assigned them to a simulation. We had 6 different links, and so within Qualtrics you can randomize participants into different blocks. Each block in our case had a different link, and so depending on which block participants got, be given a specific link, and that link would take them to the condition that they were assigned to. So whether the NPCs were running, hiding, or mixed, and then also whether the emotion condition was high or low. And so once participants began the survey, the first thing we had them do was test their movement. As you can imagine, a simulation like this, we want to make sure that participants aren't standing still, not because they're scared, but because they quite just don't know how to move. And so the first part of the training was, there was just these red balls in a diagonal pattern, and they just had to be able to kind of touch all the balls and then crouch underneath something. So that way we could test that they're able to move and that they can crouch. A lot of that was one of the big options in this survey is, do you want to crouch behind cover or something? Then the second part of the training, we gave them different objectives around the school. For example, to go to the infirmary, to go to a specific classroom, to go to one of the exits. And there were 7 total objectives. This helped them familiarize themselves with the school, as they were constantly going back and forth. This wasn't one of those things where one objective was just right next to each other. They were basically crossing almost the full length of the school for each objective. And so that way, we were trying to get them as familiar with the school as possible. If participants could not complete the trainings in 15 minutes, this is both part 1 and 2, then we just had them kind of end the entire survey. This is because we still want to pay these participants for their time, and we don't want them to add to the to add to the median completion time, meaning we'd have to pay participants more. But these participants were not included in any sort of final data analysis. So we wanted to ensure that the data that we had was from participants who understood the movement and understood the school.
Great. So, like, if you were just doing a paper survey or I mean a digital question survey, you would want to make sure that people that didn't have the reading comprehension to understand the questions weren't mixed into your data. You'd want to make sure that people didn't kind of answer the first couple and then just sit there and then drop out at the end. But when you're doing this video game, you basically had to build like a test level at the start of it to make sure that somebody knows how to navigate and make sure that somebody's not an outlier in the amount of time that it takes them to do kind of that test navigation. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, exactly. So, an event like a school shooting is often over in seconds. These are not events that last too long. And so we want to make sure that if a participant spent their first 15 seconds standing still, that wasn't just because they all of a sudden forgotten how to move because they'd read some paper instructions. We wanted to make sure that they had ample experience moving around the platform. And then also even small things such as their reaction time or their comfortability moving around objects was important. So we wanted to make sure that those were not as limiting factors as they could have been. And so we tried to give them as many paper instructions as you would in a traditional survey, but we also wanted to give them as much time as possible to experience and understand it. Because we found those participants with more FPS or first person shooter game experience tended to escape the school faster. And we don't think that there's any difference in their behavior. We think this is mostly just chalked up to the fact that they feel more comfortable moving around virtual environments. And so, one of the things that we discussed in the paper is that if these kinds of trainings are implemented in the future, whether it's for law enforcement or for students, is to ensure that people are comfortable in these virtual environments because we don't want the training to then not carry over into a real life environment where people would definitely be more comfortable moving around.
Yeah, and something that surprised me, and it's probably a matter of when you have to use these kind of representative sample tools, that are with academic research rather than just kind of informal research, that the mean age, the average age of your participant was 35 years old. And that was with almost an 11-year standard deviation. So most of your participants were between 24 all the way up to 47. And if we just think about the amount of video game time and different exposure, somebody who's in their mid 20s is probably going to have significantly more comfort operating in this digital environment kind of without a lot of instruction compared to somebody who's 47 years old. Did you see any kind of indications of that in your results?
Yes, so in the regression in the results, I believe the age variable was significant, not in this paper, but in the previous study. And that I think is mostly due to the fact that the older participants had less experience with these video games, whether they're first person shooters or any other ones where you would be moving around in a virtual environment. And so it's something that in future studies you would definitely want to control, especially if we're specifically focused on schools. The layout of this specific school can also be converted into a standard office format. And so that's one of the reasons that we chose to keep the uh, population to be representative of the US population is again the results here, we're not saying that this is exactly how children will behave. We're just trying to see how people would move around in any sort of virtual environment and how would they respond to a school shooting or even some sort of other emergency situations such as maybe you're in the cafeteria and the fire alarm or something gets pulled. And so, how do you respond to that based on how your peers respond?
And I think what was fascinating about this is that you randomly assigned people into six groups. And it's six groups because there were three conditions associated with how the non player characters, the NPCs around them, behaved when the shooting happened. And there were two conditions around the level of emotional response that the scenario would elicit. How did you come up with those categories? And can you uh, kind of explain what it looked like in the scenario for a player under each of those six conditions?
Yes, so I'll start with kind of breaking them individually and then what the combination would look like. So for for the non-player characters or NPCs behavior, when they're running, the shooter would enter the cafeteria about 5 to 10 seconds after the simulation starts, just so that the and I should say the data collection portion of the simulation starts. Is at this point the participants have completed their training, but once the shooter enters, he'll pause for about a second and then he'll begin firing. In response to that, in the run condition, you would see the NPCs, everyone's sitting around eating lunch. You would see the NPCs kind of stand up or turn their heads, one of the two motions, notice the threat, understand the threat, and within a second, they would all get up and start running. And so, in a low emotion condition, there would be minimal screaming, there'd be minimal blood. You wouldn't hear any sort of other audio of people being concerned, freaking out, etc. In the high emotion condition, there was more blood spatter, both like visually on like near the participant and also just when any NPC got shot throughout the simulation. There was a lot more audio. That I think was the biggest change between the two conditions. Is the screaming was more intense, it was more visceral, and there was also more non-screaming audio, such as people saying like, okay, like maybe shouting their concern, like, oh my god, something's happening, etc. There's a shooter. And so that would be like the run condition with the two emotion conditions. In the sorry, that would be in the hide condition, what you would see is similar. For the first few seconds after the shooting begins, the NPCs would stand up and they would observe the threat. But rather than running straight to an exit outside of the school, they would run to somewhere in the school to hide. So this could be the bathroom, one of the classrooms. There was a kitchen in the bath of the cafeteria. And so some of the NPCs would go run and hide back there. And in the mixed condition, these NPCs are beginning where they would begin in the run and the hide condition. It's just now that they've been randomized for each participant to either follow the instructions in their run or in their hide conditions. And so, the same NPC essentially has one run behavior coded and one hide behavior coded. And so in the mixed, we're just saying, okay, you are going to now do your run behavior and you're going to do your hide behavior.
So what you were able to measure with that is, first, does the person follow what previous training you're given, or does the person kind of follow the behavior of the crowd around them? And how much of an influence did you see based on that condition of whether all of the NPCs were running, all of them were hiding, or whether it was mixed on what the human participant then did in those scenarios?
So for the results, the non-player character NPC behavior was definitely had a stronger effect compared to the emotion conditions. We did see that when the NPCs ran, that participants were more likely to like exit the school. And I believe the variable that we use in the paper is whether they spent the majority of their time running away. And so this is coded as, for each half second, were they getting farther from their initial starting point? Essentially, like, were they going towards an exit? And so we find in the run condition, where the NPCs are all running, participants are more likely to run themselves. In the hide condition, participants were more likely to hide. However, overall, the majority of participants still ran away or exited the school. It was just that they were more likely to hide in the hide condition. And then finally, in the mixed condition, it was somewhere in the middle of those two. And so you saw that it wasn't as much as the run, but it was still more than the hide. For the emotion condition, there was really no effect. Our best guess is that this is something that isn't really well simulated in a virtual environment. A lot of people, whether they're older or younger, are desensitized to violence in a virtual environment. You watch movies with a lot of violence and gore, or you play video games where the amount of violence occurring in this simulation is nothing compared to a modern Call of Duty game, for example. And so that one did not have a strong effect. I just want to mention another paper. So this is, I would say, maybe part 3 in this series. Is we have a paper called Pumped Up Kicks: The Impact of Social Contagion and Informational Cues on Evacuation Behavior and Exposure to Threat in a Simulated School Crisis. And this can be found for the HICS, or the Hawaiian International Conference. Sorry, I forgot the acronym, but it's HICCS. It's a HICS proceedings paper. And
to pause there for a second,
yeah,
Pumped Up Kicks, I get the reference, but can you fill in the audience because
Oh, yes,
that is
there's
a
a
great
song.
little coded phrase in there.
I've been waiting to use this in some paper. I'm really happy to give. I'll be presenting this paper at the Higgs conference in January, and so it won't be out until the proceedings are out. But "Pumped Up Kicks" is a reference to a song by, I believe, the band is Foster the People, essentially about a school shooting. And so, yeah, I thought great little way to begin the
Little Easter
paper.
egg stuck in there.
Yeah, for the people that know, it always gets a reaction. And um, but I highly encourage people that were interested in this paper to check out this Pumped Up Kicks paper, because I think our in a deep independent variables were not so strong in this paper. However, in the Pumped Up Kicks paper, we have three conditions. So we have three factors, if you will, with three levels each. So we retain the factor of the non-player characters hiding, running, or their behavior being mixed. But we add two new factors, which is we give them something we call proximal instructions. And so this is whether a student around them tells the participant to run, tells the participant to hide, or does not say anything. Additionally, we have a public address or PA manipulation, where at some point after the shooting, a public address announcement would come on and it would say, there's an active shooter in the building, please hide. There's an active shooter in the building, please evacuate or run away, or there's no public address. And I think this, in addition to the actual NPCs running around you, really shows the effect of how strong the NPC behavior was. Because even with these instructions, we found that if the proximal instructions and the public address instructions were telling you to hide, but the NPCs around you were running, participants were still more likely to run. And so it was consistently across the studies. It was the one independent variable that we always retained, and it's because I think it has such a strong effect. And so it's something that I think future researchers and policymakers should definitely consider, is that if there's gonna, you hear about these leader um, people that have been told to give instructions on to kind of start, let's say, an evacuation process, because they know that once these leaders or individuals that are more likely to take action begin an action such as running away, that others are more likely to follow them. And this is a simple kind of, I don't want to use the word trick, but a simple device that could be used to help reduce casualties and ensure more people get to safety. So.
And I think that speaks to everybody's experience when you have a fire alarm, whether it's in an office, in a dorm, in your apartment, at a restaurant that you're at dinner at. You hear the fire alarm, and if you hear a fire alarm, you're supposed to evacuate. But the first thing that everybody does is look around at everyone else. And if nobody else is moving, if nobody else in your office suite is getting up from their computer, then there's a good chance you're just going to continue working as well. So I think you're reinforcing something that we've probably known in emergency services for a long time, which is that people are going to react to what's going on around them uh, based on the cues from other people more than whatever official messaging that they're getting. And an incident that happened close to home for me here in Orlando was 2 years ago at the 4th of July fireworks. There was a bang which people mistook for a gunshot. And even though there were immediate messages and text messages and PA announcements that there's not a shooting, the crowd continued to run and continued to run. And that grew to the point over a period of minutes at this large venue to where the entire fireworks had to be canceled because so many people had fled. Because once they saw people fleeing in one part of this large park, then more people were fleeing in other parts of the park. So we as social human creatures are always going to be looking to other people for cues beyond something maybe we're hearing over a speaker or seeing on our phone.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's something that the researchers know, but doesn't always get implemented, for schools, um, evacuation processes and stuff. And I think that's really the importance of teachers taking authority in a lot of these situations, is especially with younger students, they'll be more likely to listen. But it's something that if the teachers, can get the information that they need and make decisive actions. I know a lot of schools now have some sort of alert system where if anything happens, the teachers will all get a text message instantly. And that's not something that my school had when I was in high school, but it's something that was implemented following the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas school shooting. I was a senior in high school when that happened. And so, even visiting my high school 1 or 2 years later, there was a sweep of security changes in response to that. And so,
Now, you've had three different iterations of this with your pretty advanced simulation, but in academia, we're still limited by the survey tools that we have. We're limited by the interface. Your simulation doesn't look like, Call of Duty or Grand Theft Auto or any of kind of the premier video game labs, and a keyboard and a mouse, are a less intuitive interface than a controller, which lots of people have used. If you had the resources to design this simulation in any way that you wanted, what would kind of be your dreams simulation scenario, and what do you think you could test from that?
oh, that's a great question. I think about this a lot. And so you'll see a lot of our collaborators, such as Alyssa, Nutt, and Stacy. These are researchers either at or were with Northeastern University. And they were the ones who actually developed the simulation itself. They're the computer scientists behind the actual coding of the simulation. My advisor Richard John and I are more behind the psychology and the behavioral parts of it. And so I think if I had a full team of researchers instead of an undergraduate, then I would probably want a controller based simulation. The reason for that is there have been papers using VR, virtual reality. And I think while the virtual reality maybe seems more intuitive to people in the sense of, you'd be running around as if you were actually in this environment, I think the technology is not as familiar to participants. And so there's a larger learning curve. And so that's something that I suppose with unlimited resources and unlimited time to train, maybe VR would then be the best. But I think practically something like a controller would be ideal mix of I can get participants, especially if I'm focusing on younger participants who are currently in school, as I'm sure they're familiar with some sort of controller. And then I think making the simulation as realistic as possible would be preferred. I think in an ideal world, I would be able to go into schools and then essentially create, 3D scans of the school and map it out to an exact amount and place participants with ideally too, maybe at a specific school, if this is the model, getting those participants and one time having participants in person run away or hide as if it was a real school shooting, and using that as the basis for the NPCs or non-player characters in the simulation, because it's something that you spend a lot of money at first and you invest in. You can then take that and either apply it to other schools or even train law enforcement officers off of that. And so because you can repeat this scenario as many times as you need to for this initial cost, their response shouldn't change too much just because the school looks different. What they'll be practicing is the methods and the principles behind their response. And so,
Yeah, something that I've written about, and I code in the school shooting data now, is there are basically 9 different types of campuses across the country. I think anybody who's from the Midwest uh, thinks about this brick schoolhouse that has one front door that's up some steps, and then one long hallway, and all the classrooms are off that hallway, and maybe the cafeteria or office or something is at the end. But in reality, lots of schools are different formats. You have schools that are multiple buildings that are all attached together, because as the school has been renovated over time, they keep adding another floor and another wing, and you end up with these U-shaped and Z-shaped and T-shaped buildings that have hallways going in lots of different directions. In your big cities, Chicago and New York, you have schools that are the first 4 or 5 floors of a high-rise building. You have schools that are a standalone 6 or 7 floor building. You have schools that are a mini fenced campus in what looks like kind of an industrial 3 or 4 story building. And then you go to where you are in Southern California and Arizona and some of the Southwest, schools often don't have indoor hallways because the weather's so nice. So every single building on the campus is its own little standalone building. And then you have all these outdoor spaces, like covered walkways between them. And then in Texas and Oklahoma and some of the Midwest, where they've consolidated school districts, they have these mega schools where the schools have multiple indoor basketball courts, have Olympic pools, have full theaters, have indoor football practice facilities, shopping malls, multi-floor cafeterias with like 5 to 6,000 students in those schools. So it would be fascinating to run the exact same simulation in different campus types to see if somebody who's in, a mega school with 5,000 people, where you might have 500 yards of indoor hallway before your closest exit, compared to somebody in a Southern California school where your classroom has 2 exits and they both go directly to the outside. If you hear shots inside, are you going to stay inside? If you hear shots outside, what are you going to do? That would be fascinating to see how the built environment changes the way that people respond.
Yeah, and so that's something that I agree. I think it's super interesting. And so I went to school. Actually, grew up in Florida, about an hour and a half south of Tampa, in a city called Northport, if you're familiar with it. But my school is, I would say it's pretty distinct from at least a lot of the other high schools I visited, where now I believe, based on current students that go there, it is completely, there are buildings and it is an outdoor campus that, you would walk to. But when I went, they were trying to build all these buildings. And so you had portables all over the place. And the way they built the school was they bought part of a state park. And so it's built on like swamplands. And before this Marjorie Stoneman Douglas school shooting, you could just kind of exit campus. Like there was no fence or anything. There was a line of portables and then there was the woods. And so, I think people raise a lot of questions about adding the fence obviously keeps people out, but it also introduces this new variable of if you want to escape, it creates this clogging behavior because you now have to go to a dedicated door along this fence instead of just being able to kind of mass out, run into the woods. And so it's something that my team and I haven't discussed, but I know other researchers have looked into the architecture and design principles. I think this is especially a big topic for schools that are in more urban centers, where rather than being spread out in multiple buildings in some sort of outdoor campus, they're all in one building. And because, this can really, I think that's where security countermeasures are especially important because you really only have one chance to identify the shooter before they're in a really dense student environment. And so yeah, I think it's super interesting work, and we've definitely integrated some of those principles into some of our papers because that's kind of how this research got started, and it's also something that is always, running parallel to what we do.
And my last question for you is, from these 3 different papers, what do you think are the biggest takeaways, either for policy or training or just people that are in a school that want to take some kind of ad hoc direction in preparing their students? What would you recommend that people do based on your findings?
I think based on these three papers, the the biggest finding is, people are going to respond to how others around them are responding. So if people around them are running, they themselves will be more likely to run. And you can try to give either proximal or public address instructions. So I think the key here is making sure that students have enough experience and understanding that in any sort of evacuation, and this is not limited to school shootings, this can be a fire drill, this can be something else, that people know where to go and they have a clear plan. And so I think this is something that you see people rehearse a lot, that during a fire, people get out and they just kind of walk outside and you line up and you wait for your teacher to count you. And that's probably the best you can do without inciting too much panic. But I think it's making sure that the students understand that in a more stressful situation that they need to follow the same behavior and not end up in a situation where they're um, you know, cornering themselves too early. If they hear gunshots super far away, it's making sure that the school has a clear plan that, okay, the teacher or some sort of, executive decision maker is making that decision that I believe that the threat is far away, and that I think my students would be the safest if we could evacuate from the school and not wait for the threat to essentially come to us. And so you mentioned this in the beginning of the talk, that run, hide, fight is something that you hear flowing around a lot, but it's not necessarily based on any empirical evidence. And I think that the more research that we can do to show that run, hide, fight in this vague context might not be the most adequate policy decision is something that, like going forward, we should revise essentially.
And what would it take for a simulation like yours to be available to the general public or available to any school administrator to play with and use? Because obviously, for these papers, you create something, you have some grant funding to do it. But if somebody was really interested in making this into like a kind of functional simulation that you could use in schools, what kind of infrastructure and things would you need to do that?
So this project was originally funded by Century, which is a Department of Homeland Security grant. Century is a center of excellence to the Department of Homeland Security. So through Northeastern University, um, all that to say, without wasting too much time in those specifics, the project has now been canceled. And so if researchers wanted to work with what we had and improve upon it, I would say, I guess right now the best thing to do would be to reach out to one of the co-authors on the paper. You can reach out to me. I'm sure David will include my contact information in the show notes. And it's something that you just need to download the Unity software. Unity is a software used to develop video games. It is a paid software. I believe there are free student versions and trial versions, but you can take this game that we've developed with all the skins and character packages, etc., and then make your modifications, whether it's to the actual architecture, to the shooter behavior, to the NPC behavior, etc. It is something that I believe you would need experience with video game design to do, but I don't think it's anything that you would need advanced expertise with. It's something that you could pick up if needed. And it's something that the general principles could then be extended if you wanted to make your own school shooting simulation.
Well, hopefully there are some folks listening that might be interested in that, because it sounds like you've created kind of a pretty unique and very useful framework for running this kind of simulation. So I want to thank you again. The guest today was Kevin Capadia. He is a PhD candidate at the University of Southern California. The new paper, which I'll be looking forward to seeing when it comes out in January, is Pumped Up Kicks. This paper, which we discussed today, where the link is below, is Run, Hide, or Freeze: Social and Emotional Influence on Behavior in an Immersive School Shooting Simulation. So Kevin, thanks for your time and effort on this, and I think it will hopefully make a difference in the future.
Thank you, and I hope it does. It was great talking with you.
Absolutely.